The Texas sun doesn't just shine, it interrogates. It bleaches the very soul out of the land, leaving behind a canvas of cracked earth and skeletal mesquite. It was under this merciless gaze in the heart of the Comanchia that a lone woman found a man dying. He wasn't just any man. He was sprawled in a shallow ravine, a place the locals called a Scorpion Hollow, and for good reason. Dozens of them, pale and venomous, crawled over his body, but the greatest venom wasn't in their stingers. It was in the secret he carried in his blood, a secret that could either ignite a war to end all wars or build a bridge between two worlds. She saw only a man in need. She had no idea she was about to pull the heir to the entire Comanche nation back from the brink of death. The year was 1874. The place was the ragged edge of the Texas Panhandle, a land of brutal beauty and swift violence. Maeve O'Connell knew its harsh poetry better than anyone. It had been 2 years since a rattlesnake had made her a widow, leaving her with nothing but 160 acres of stubborn soil, a sod-walled house that wept mud in the rain, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Her husband, Seamus, had called this land their stake in God's country. Maeve now called it her purgatory. Her days were a litany of hard labor, dictated by the sun's rise and fall. That particular afternoon, the heat was a tangible thing, a shimmering curtain that distorted the horizon. One of her 2 goats, Agnes, had wandered off likely in search of some mythical patch of green. Cursing under her breath, a canteen sloshing at her hip, Maeve tracked the goat's cloven hoofprints through the dust and brittle grass. The trail led her toward a series of rocky arroyos, jagged scars on the landscape, where water sometimes ran, but where danger always lurked. That's when she heard it. Not a cry for help, not a human sound at all, but a faint, rhythmic clicking. It was the sound of 100 tiny nightmares. Peering over the edge of a shallow, sun-baked ravine, her blood ran cold. Down below, sprawled on his back, was a man. He was stripped to a breechcloth, his bronze skin a roadmap of cuts and bruises. His long black hair was fanned out in the dust like spilled ink, but it was his companions that made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. Scorpions. Dozens of them, the color of old bone, were crawling over him. Their tails were arched, stingers glistening. The clicking was the sound of their chitinous bodies moving over the rocks and each other. Her first instinct, the one honed by years of frontier survival, was to back away slowly. He was almost certainly dead. And if he wasn't, he was likely Comanche. The homesteaders spoke of them in hushed, terrified tones, ghosts on horseback who appeared without warning and vanished without a trace, leaving only fire and sorrow behind. This man's high cheekbones and the single eagle feather tied in his hair screamed warrior. Getting involved was a death sentence one way or another. She started to turn her heart, hammering against her ribs. But then she saw it, a slight twitch in his fingers, a barely perceptible flutter of his eyelids. He was alive. Maeve stood frozen, a war raging within her. Seamus had been a good man, a man who believed in a Christian duty to help, but Seamus was dead. The frontier had taught her that compassion was a luxury, a soft emotion that could get you killed. Yet she looked at the man below, at the mercy of the sun and the venom, and she saw not a warrior, not an enemy, but a human being on the threshold of a miserable death. She thought of her own lonely existence, of the crushing silence in her sod house. What was the point of surviving if you sacrificed the last shred of your humanity to do it? With a resolved sigh that sounded more like a sob, she scrambled down the loose rock of the arroyo. The scorpions scattered as her boots hit the ground, their clicking growing frantic. They retreated into the shadows of the rocks, their tails still poised. She knelt beside the man, her shadow falling across his face. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps in his early 20s. His face, even slack and bruised, held a kind of fierce nobility. A deep gash on his temple was caked with dried blood, and his lips were cracked and swollen. Dehydration was killing him, as surely as any venom might. She uncorked her canteen and gently lifted his head. She let a few drops of precious water fall onto his lips. He moaned a low, guttural sound, and his eyes flickered open. They were dark, unfocused, and filled with a universe of pain. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. Getting him out of there was an ordeal. He was lean but tall and dense with muscle. Maeve was strong from her years of farm work, but dragging his dead weight up the side of the ravine under the punishing sun nearly broke her. She looped his arm over her shoulder, half carrying, half dragging him, her feet slipping on the scree. Every few steps she'd pause, her lungs burning, and glance back nervously, expecting to see a war party cresting the hill. By the time she got him back to her homestead, the sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon. She maneuvered him through the door of her small one-room sod house and onto her own narrow cot. The air inside was cool and smelled of earth and dried herbs. In the dim light of her lantern, she finally got a proper look at him. His body was a canvas of violence. Beyond the cuts and the deep exhaustion, she found 3 distinct puncture marks on his leg, already red and swollen scorpion stings. They were inflamed, but thankfully didn't look like they'd come from a bark scorpion, the deadliest kind. He must have been stung early on, and his body had been fighting the venom for hours, if not a day. What truly worried her was the wound on his head and the fever that was already beginning to radiate from his skin. She worked through the night, a silent, determined spectre. She cleaned his wounds with carbolic soap, a rare and expensive commodity she saved for emergencies. She ground up a poultice of yarrow and plantain remedies her Irish grandmother had taught her, adapted for the plants of this new, harsh world, and applied it to the stings and the gash on his head. She forced sips of water, and later a thin broth between his lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in a language she didn't understand. The words were soft, flowing nothing like the harsh, guttural commands she'd imagined. In his delirium, he wasn't a fearsome warrior. He was just a boy, lost and in pain. Once his eyes opened and focused on her clear for just a moment, there was no hatred in them, only confusion, and a flicker of something else, gratitude. Then the fever pulled him back under. As dawn broke, painting the plains in shades of rose and gold, Maeve sat in her lone chair, watching him breathe. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of his ragged breaths. She had invited the most dangerous thing in Texas into her home. She had no idea who he was or who might be looking for him. She only knew that she had crossed a line. There was no going back. Her quiet, lonely purgatory had just been breached, and she had a terrifying feeling that hell, or perhaps salvation, was about to follow. The days that followed blurred into a tense routine of survival and secrecy. Maeve called him Cole. It was a simple, solid name, easier on her tongue than the fluid, complex sounds he made in his fever dreams. Cole remained mostly unconscious for the first 3 days, a silent, breathing statue in her bed. During this time, Maeve lived on a knife's edge. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow in the distance looked like a rider. She kept her late husband's Winchester rifle propped by the door, and the cult peacemaker Seamus had insisted she learn to use was never far from her hand. Her fear was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She was harboring a Comanche. If any of her distant neighbors found out, they'd form a mob. If his own people found him here, they might see her as a captor, not a savior. She was utterly terrifyingly alone in her decision. Cole's fever broke on the fourth night in a deluge of sweat that soaked the thin mattress. Maeve was by his side wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. His eyes opened, and this time they stayed open. The delirium was gone, replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence. He looked at her, then at the unfamiliar surroundings, the rough-hewn table, the stone fireplace, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. He tried to sit up a flash of alarm on his face, but a wave of dizziness and pain sent him back down with a groan. Maeve held up a hand, a gesture she hoped conveyed peace. "Easy now," she said softly. "You're safe." He stared at her. His dark eyes narrowed. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He looked at the clean bandage on his head, the poultice on his leg. He slowly, cautiously seemed to relax. Communication was a frustrating pantomime. He would point to the water bucket, and she would bring him a dipper. She would point to the stew pot, and he would nod or shake his head. His gestures were spare and precise. Hers felt clumsy and foolish in comparison. She learned that he preferred the rabbit stew to the salted pork. He learned that the strange, bitter liquid she drank in the mornings was called coffee. Slowly she began to see the man behind the fearsome image of the Comanche warrior. There was a quiet dignity about him, an economy of motion that spoke of immense physical control. When he was finally strong enough to stand, he moved with a predator's grace, even while wincing from his injuries. He watched everything she did, his gaze missing nothing, the way she patched her dress, the way she checked the horizon, the way she spoke to her goats as if they were confidants. One afternoon, a week after she found him, the outside world intruded. A rider approached the homestead. Maeve's heart leaped into her throat. She shoved Cole towards the small root cellar hidden under a loose floorboard. "Get in, now! Don't make a sound!" She hissed, her voice tight with panic. He looked at her, then at the door, understanding instantly. He slipped into the dark hole without a word, pulling the floorboard back into place, just as a sharp knock echoed on the door. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened it. It was Jedediah Kane. Kane was a man who owned most of the nearby town of Redemption Wells, a man whose ambition was as vast and empty as the plains themselves. He was dressed in a black suit, absurdly formal for the heat, his face shadowed by the brim of a fine hat. Two hard-faced men on horseback, his hired guns, flanked him at a distance. "Afternoon, Mrs. O'Connell," Kane said, his voice a smooth, oily baritone. He removed his hat, revealing slicked-back hair. "Just checking on our most isolated resident." "I'm fine, Mr. Kane," Maeve said, her hand gripping the doorframe. She did not invite him in. "That's good to hear." He smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "It's a dangerous world out here for a woman alone. I was just saying to my man Silas here." He gestured to a hulking man with a scarred face. "It's a miracle you've managed so long. Which brings me back to my offer. It still stands. A fair price for this patch of dust. Enough to get you a nice, safe room back east. And I've given you my answer, Mr. Kane. This was my husband's land. It's my land now. I'm not selling." Maeve's voice was steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. She knew Kane wanted her land, and she knew it wasn't for the grazing. Her well fed by a deep spring was the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction. With it, he could control the entire region. Kane's smile tightened. "Stubbornness is an admirable trait, Mrs. O'Connell, until it becomes foolishness. There are elements out here, hostiles. They've been raiding more frequently. A woman alone." He let the threat hang in the air. "I can take care of myself," she said, her chin high. "I hope so," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "For your sake." He turned and walked back to his horse, a predator leaving a scent mark on its territory. Maeve watched until they were small figures on the horizon, before she bolted the door and sank against it, her body trembling. She let Cole out of the cellar. He emerged silently, his eyes questioning. She couldn't explain the nuances of land deeds and greedy men, but he had seen the look on Kane's face, the menace in his posture. He understood threat. That evening, as Maeve was cleaning her rifle, a routine born of renewed fear, Cole gestured for it. She hesitated. Handing a weapon to a Comanche warrior felt like the ultimate act of folly. But his eyes were steady, showing no malice. She passed it to him, butt first. He took it with a familiarity that startled her. He checked the action, sighted down the barrel and tested the weight. It was clear he knew the weapon intimately. Then he did something unexpected. He gestured to her, then to the rifle, and made a motion of aiming. He wanted to see her use it. Slightly bewildered, she took the rifle back. She aimed at a knot on a distant fence post and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was deafening in the evening quiet. The wood splintered a clean hit. Cole nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Then he picked up a small stone from the floor. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the air. Before it could begin its descent, he drew a knife she hadn't even known he possessed from a sheath in his breechcloth and threw it. The knife spun end over end, a silver blur, and struck the stone with a sharp tink, sending it flying off into the dusk. Maeve stared, speechless. He had done it with effortless precision. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement. He was showing her that he too was a protector. He was showing her he was a warrior. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. He was no longer just a patient, a helpless man she had saved. He was a force to be reckoned with, a wolf she had brought into her fold. And as she looked at him, standing there in the dim light of her home, she realized her fear was changing. She was still afraid of Kane and of the world outside. But she was no longer afraid of the man standing in front of her. She was starting to feel something else entirely, a terrifying, dangerous sense of alliance. The delicate trust forged by the display of weapons grew in the quiet that followed. Cole began to mend his strength, returning with astonishing speed. He started helping with chores, his sharp eyes seeing what needed to be done before Maeve even asked. He'd mend a fence post with surprising skill, using his knife to notch the wood with a craftsman's precision. He moved with a silent purpose that made her own efforts feel loud and clumsy. Their wordless communication evolved into a language of its own, made of gestures, drawings, and shared understanding. One evening, determined to bridge the chasm between them, Maeve brought out a charred stick and a piece of smoothed bark. She drew a crude picture of her house. "House," she said, pointing to it, then to her chest. "Maeve." Cole watched intently. He took the stick from her. His hand, so deadly with a knife, was remarkably steady. He drew a series of rolling hills and then a collection of tipis. He pointed to the tipis, then tapped his own chest. Then he drew a magnificent eagle, its wings spread wide. He tapped the eagle, then himself again. Maeve's mind raced. Was Eagle his name? It seemed too simple. He then drew a larger, more ornate tipi, and next to it a man with a full flowing war bonnet. The man in the drawing radiated authority. Cole pointed to this figure, and then made a gesture she recognized from her own culture. He bowed his head slightly, a sign of deep respect. Then he pointed from the man in the bonnet to himself, and drew a straight line connecting them. "Father." The word struck her like a physical blow. The man in the drawing was his father. And the war bonnet. That wasn't for just any warrior. That was the mark of a chief. A great chief. The implications settled over her cold and heavy. She hadn't just saved a random warrior lost on the plains. The dignity she'd sensed in him, the innate authority in his bearing, it wasn't just his personality. It was his birthright. She was sheltering Comanche nobility. The thought was so staggering, so far outside the realm of her harsh, simple reality, that she felt a wave of dizziness. He wasn't finished. He took the stick again and drew a second figure next to his own, a man with a sly, almost jaggedly drawn face. He drew a snake, a rattlesnake its fangs bared, and placed it behind the back of his own self-portrait. Then he drew a line from the snake to the sly-faced man. Betrayal. The story was as old as time, and it needed no words. Someone he trusted, someone from his own tribe, had tried to kill him. He hadn't been defeated in a raid or lost in a storm. He had been left for dead by his own kind. Maeve looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the pain behind his stoic facade. He was not just a warrior, he was an exile, a prince cast out. The knowledge reframed everything. His silence wasn't just a language barrier, it was the quiet of a man who had lost his world. His watchfulness wasn't just warrior's instinct, it was the caution of a man who knew his enemy could look like his brother. This revelation cemented her resolve. Her fear for her own safety was now eclipsed by a fierce, protective instinct towards him. He was no longer a potential threat she was managing, but a man who had been wronged, a man who, like her, was utterly alone. Their life fell into a new rhythm. He began to teach her things. He showed her how to read the land, to see the subtle signs of animal tracks, to know which plants were edible and which were poison. He taught her a way to find water by watching the flight of birds in the morning. He taught her how to move silently, to place her feet so the dry ground wouldn't betray her presence. These were the skills of his people, the secrets of survival in this unforgiving land, and he gave them to her freely. In return, she taught him her language. She would point to objects and say their names slowly and clearly. Chair, table, fire. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and hungry for the words. He would repeat them, his tongue struggling with the foreign sounds at first, but soon mastering them. The first time he spoke a full sentence, the sound of his voice speaking her language filled the small house with a strange and powerful intimacy. The sky is fire, he said one evening, looking out the open door at the sunset. His voice was a low baritone, softer than she'd imagined. Maeve felt her heart skip a beat. Yes, she whispered. It is. The shared language opened a new door between them. He told her his name was not Eagle, but Tavak, which meant sun in his tongue. The eagle was part of his identity, a spiritual connection. He told her of his people, the Quahadi, the antelope eaters, the proudest and most remote of all the Comanche bands. He spoke of his father, Chief Esatai, Coyote's Cry, a wise and respected leader, and he told her the name of the man who had betrayed him, Mo Wei, his cousin. As he spoke, Maeve's world expanded. The Comanche were no longer a faceless, terrifying horde from her neighbors' stories. They were a people, with families, with loyalties, and betrayals, with love for their land and their way of life. She was living with their future. But the outside world and its dangers were never far away. Jedediah Kane's pressure was becoming more direct. One day, Maeve found one of her goats with its leg broken, a cruel, deliberate act. Another time, the bucket to her well was cut, sent plunging into the depths. They were warnings designed to break her spirit, to make her feel the icy grip of her isolation. Kane, however, had made a critical miscalculation. Maeve O'Connell was no longer isolated. She was no longer alone. She had a prince in her sod house. And Kane's petty cruelty was about to awaken a force he could not possibly comprehend. The broken goat leg was the final violation. It was a petty, cruel act that spoke volumes about Jedediah Kane's character. When Maeve found the poor animal bleating in pain, a cold, hard fury settled in her heart, displacing the last vestiges of fear. She and Tavak worked together to set the leg, their hands moving with a practiced synergy. Tavak fashioned a splint from scavenged wood and strips of leather, his touch surprisingly gentle. "He will not stop," Tavak said that evening, his English growing more confident each day. He was staring into the fire, but his gaze was distant, seeing not the flames, but the threat they represented. Men like this Kane, they drink power like water. They are always thirsty. "He thinks I'm a helpless widow," Maeve said, her voice tight with anger. "He thinks he can scare me off my land." "He is wrong," Tavak stated simply. It was not a compliment. It was a fact. He had seen her resilience, her quiet strength. He stood up and walked to the door, peering out into the vast, star-dusted darkness. "They will come again, not to warn, to take." His words were prophetic. 3 nights later, the attack came. Maeve was jolted from a light sleep by the frantic barking of her dog, Buster. It wasn't his usual yapping at a passing coyote. This was a desperate, panicked sound that was cut off with a sickening yelp. In the same instant, Tavak was on his feet, moving with a fluid silence that was unnerving. He grabbed the Winchester from its place by the door. "Get down," he whispered, his voice a low command. A flicker of orange light danced outside the single small window. The smell of smoke began to snake through the cracks in the door. They had set her small barn on fire, the barn that housed her remaining goat and 2 chickens. It was a message, written in flame. "Stay here," Tavak ordered, his eyes glinting in the dark. "Like hell I will," Maeve shot back, grabbing the Colt Peacemaker. "This is my home." A look of surprise, followed by something akin to deep respect, flashed across his face. He nodded once. "The window. I will take the door." Gunshots erupted, splintering the thick wooden door. Bullets thudded into the sod walls, absorbed by the dense earth. From the shouts outside, Maeve could make out at least 3 distinct voices, rough and taunting. One of them belonged to Silas Kane's hulking henchman. "Come on out, little lady. Mr. Kane has a deed that needs signing," Silas roared, followed by cruel laughter. Tavok didn't wait. He kicked the bar away from the door and threw it open, but instead of charging out, he dropped low and rolled to the side into the deep shadows along the wall of the house. The move was so swift, so unexpected, that the men outside, blinded by the firelight from the barn, fired at an empty doorway. It was the only opening they needed. From her position at the window, Maeve saw a man raising his rifle. She steadied her shaking hands, remembered Seamus's instruction, breathe out, squeeze, don't jerk, and fired the Colt. The recoil bucked in her hand, the sound deafening in the small space. The man screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching a shattered shoulder. Simultaneously, a blur of motion erupted from the shadows outside. Tavak moved like a phantom. He was not a brawling cowboy. He was a warrior, and his fighting was a terrifying art form. He closed the distance to a second gunman before the man could even turn. Maeve saw the gleam of Tavak's knife, a swift, precise arc. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Silas, the leader, bellowed in rage and surprise. He turned, firing his pistol wildly toward the place where Tavak had been. But Tavak was no longer there. He used the chaos and the flickering light to his advantage, a ghost in the night. Maeve knew she had to help. Silas was big and dangerous, focused entirely on the threat he couldn't see. She burst out the door, her own fear a distant drumbeat behind the roar of adrenaline in her ears. "Looking for him, Silas!" she yelled. The big man spun around his face, a mask of shock at seeing the helpless widow wielding a pistol. The hesitation cost him. As his attention shifted to her, Tavak exploded from the darkness behind him. He didn't use his knife this time. He used the heavy stock of the Winchester, like a club, a brutal, efficient blow to the back of Silas's head. The big man dropped like a sack of grain. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the burning barn and the groans of the wounded man. The third, the one Tavak had dealt with, was dead. They stood there for a moment, chests heaving in the hellish orange light of the fire. The immediate threat was over, but a new, more terrible reality had dawned. They had crossed a point of no return. They had fought back, and now Cain would not send thugs to scare her. He would send an army to kill them. They worked quickly. Tavak bound Silas and the other wounded man with rope from the well. "They will wake," he said. "We cannot stay." "Stay. This is my home," Maeve cried, gesturing to the sod house, the dying fire, the land she had bled for. "A home is not a grave," Tavak said, his voice firm, but not unkind. He looked her directly in the eyes. "You saved my life, Maeve. Now let me save yours. We must go." She looked at the devastation at the body lying in her yard, and she knew he was right. Her stubborn stand was over. Cain had escalated the conflict to bloodshed. They packed what little they could, a sack of flour, salted meat, her canteen, and all the ammunition she had. Tavak retrieved his knife and scouted the perimeter, ensuring no one else was lurking in the darkness. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, they left. Maeve didn't look back at the smoking ruins of her barn or the small sod house. It was a shell, a place of memory. Her life was now tied to the Comanche prince beside her, a man who had been a dying stranger just a few weeks ago. They took the 2 remaining horses from Cain's men. Tavak rode with the natural grace of a man born to the saddle. He led them away from the trails, away from the town of Redemption Wells, and into the harsh, trackless wilderness of the high plains, into the heart of the Comanchia. She was leaving her world behind and entering his, not as a captive, but as an ally, and she was riding toward a destiny far more complex and dangerous than a simple fight for a piece of land. She was riding into a war for the soul of a nation. The Comanchia was not the empty wasteland Maeve had always imagined. To her settler's eyes it was a daunting, featureless expanse, but to Tavak it was a book he could read fluently. He navigated not by trails, but by the subtle curve of the land, the shape of a distant mesa, and the direction of the wind. He led them through canyons that hid them from sight, and across plateaus that offered sweeping views of any potential pursuit. For days they rode hard, speaking little, conserving their energy. The grief for her lost home was a dull ache in Maeve's chest, but the constant need for vigilance kept it at bay. She watched Tavak and learned. He taught her to listen to the silence, to distinguish the chirp of a cricket from the warning call of a prairie dog. He showed her how to build a small, smokeless fire in a pit, shielding it with rocks, so its light couldn't be seen from a distance. Her settler's dress was soon torn and useless. Tavak, with his practical knife, helped her fashion a rough tunic and leggings from a spare blanket in her saddle roll. The transformation was more than just practical. It felt symbolic. She was shedding the skin of Maeve O'Connell the homesteader and becoming someone else, someone harder and more attuned to the wild world she now inhabited. Their relationship, born in the crucible of violence, deepened in the shared solitude of the plains. The formal barriers of language and culture had been burned away in the fire at her homestead. They were now simply 2 people who depended on each other for survival. One night, sitting by their hidden fire, Maeve found herself telling him about Seamus, about their dreams and the crushing loneliness after his death. Tavak listened, his gaze steady and compassionate. When she was done, he spoke of his own loss. "Mowe was my cousin," he said, his voice low. "We learned to ride the same horse. We hunted the first deer together. I did not see the snake in his heart until it struck." The betrayal, she realized, was a wound far deeper than the gash on his temple. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would he do it?" "He wants to be chief," Tavak explained. "My father Esatai believes we must find a way to live with the white man, to trade, to talk, to keep our lands through strength, but also through wisdom. Mowe. He believes the only answer is war. He says peace makes us weak. He preaches fire and blood." He looked at Maeve, his eyes holding a profound sadness. "He uses the anger of our people, the memory of our stolen lands, to fuel his own ambition. He told me of a raid, a place to prove our strength. He led me into an ambush. Not settlers, our own men. Men loyal to him." The scale of the treachery shocked Maeve. This wasn't just jealousy, it was a coup. A few days later, Tavak suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for silence. He dismounted, pressing his ear to the ground. Maeve watched, holding her breath. "Riders," he whispered, "a small group, coming fast." He led them to a cluster of boulders hiding the horses in a narrow ravine. They climbed up, lying flat on the sun-warmed rock, peering through a small gap. Within minutes, a party of 5 Comanche warriors appeared, riding with purpose. They were not a war party. They looked like scouts. Tavak's body went rigid beside her. He recognized them. He let out a low, sharp whistle, a sound like a hawk's cry. The lead rider immediately pulled up his head, snapping in their direction. The warriors fanned out bows, drawn their eyes, scanning the rocks. Tavak stood up slowly, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. "I am Tavak Wu," he called out, his voice ringing with an authority Maeve had never heard before. The warriors stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The leader, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, lowered his bow. "Tavak," he breathed as if seeing a ghost. "Mowe told us. He said the settlers killed you. He showed us your blood on a white man's shirt." The lie was audacious, diabolical. Mowe hadn't just removed his rival. He had created a martyr to fuel the very war he craved. Tavak scrambled down the rocks with Maeve, following cautiously behind. The warriors dismounted, gathering around Tavak, their relief and joy palpable. They spoke rapidly in their own tongue, their gestures urgent and angry. The leader, whose name was Kono, kept glancing at Maeve, his expression wary. Tavak turned to her. "This is Kono. He was my father's most trusted scout. He did not believe Mowe's story. It did not feel right. He and these men have been searching not for my body, but for the truth." Tavak then told Kono the whole story, the betrayal, the Scorpion Hollow, and how Maeve had saved him. He spoke of the attack on her homestead and her courage. As he spoke, Kono's gaze on Maeve softened from suspicion to respect. But the news Kono brought was grim. Mowe had used the story of Tavak's death to seize effective control of the young, angry warriors. He had swayed the council, arguing that Esatai's peaceful stance was a path to ruin. And the final terrible piece of the puzzle fell into place. "Mowe has promised the warriors a great victory," Tavak translated, his face grim. "He has promised them new rifles, many rifles. A white man is bringing them in exchange for a promise that the Quahadi will drive all settlers from the southern plains. All but this one man who will then control the land. Jedediah Kane. Maeve whispered the name, tasting like poison. It was a perfect hellish partnership. Kane would get the land, his empire. Moway would get the weapons and the war he needed to make himself the undisputed war chief. They were using an entire nation, both of their peoples, as pawns in their game of power. They are meeting. Tavak continued the information from Kono, painting a dark picture. In 2 days, in the town, Redemption Wells, Moway will bring a token force. Kane will deliver the first shipment of rifles. The trap was set. A private deal that would unleash a public war, a firestorm that would consume everything. We have to stop them, Maeve said, her voice shaking but resolute. Kono and the other warriors looked at her, then at Tavak. They were just 7 people against 2 ambitious, ruthless leaders and their followers. The council will not listen to me without proof, Tavak said, thinking aloud. Moway's lies are strong. If we just ride into the village, it will be my word against his. He will call me a traitor who ran to a white woman for help. He will have me killed before the truth can be heard. He looked towards the distant hazy spot on the horizon that was Redemption Wells. The proof is not in our village. It is in that town. We must show our people who Moway truly is. We must show them the snake he is dealing with. The plan that began to form was born of sheer desperation. They couldn't fight Kane's guns or Moway's warriors head-on. They had to be smarter. They had to turn their enemy's treachery against them. They were going to the meeting. They were going to walk into the viper's nest. Redemption. Wells was a town built on greed and desperation. It was little more than a single dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the imposing false-fronted office of the Kane Land and Cattle Company. This was Jedediah Kane's kingdom, and his word was law. Riding into it was suicide. Walking in might just be possible. Their plan was audacious and hinged on a knife's edge. Kono and his warriors would conceal themselves in the rocky bluffs overlooking the town, a silent, deadly promise of reinforcement. Tavak and Maeve would go in alone. Their goal was not to start a fight, but to expose a truth, to detonate the alliance between Kane and Moway in a way that would be undeniable to all. You will be the ghost, Tavak told Maeve, as they made their final preparations at the base of the bluffs. He had stripped off her makeshift tunic and leggings. In their place, he'd given her a dusty, worn-out riding skirt and blouse taken from the saddlebags of Kane's men. He smudged dirt on her face, hiding her features, making her anonymous. You are a woman. In their world that makes you invisible, they will not see you as a threat. And what about you? She asked, her heart pounding. Tavak smiled, a rare, grim flash of white teeth. He was no longer Cole the quiet patient. He was Tavak Wu, son of Asatai. He had painted his face with 2 black lines, the mark of a man on a mission of vengeance. I will be the whisper in the dark. They entered the town separately as dusk fell, casting long, distorted shadows down the main street. Maeve walked with her head down her shoulders, slumped, mimicking the weary posture of a homesteader's wife coming to town for supplies. No one gave her a second glance. The town was buzzing with an unusual energy. More of Kane's hired guns lounged on the boardwalks, their pistols conspicuous at their hips. They were expecting company. Maeve's destination was the livery stable at the far end of the street, adjacent to the Kane Land Company office. According to Kono's scouting, this was where the meeting would take place, away from the prying eyes of the saloon. She bought a small bag of oats from the livery owner, a grizzled old man who barely looked at her, and then slipped into an empty stall under the pretense of checking on a lame horse. The air was thick with the smell of hay and manure. Through a grimy window, she had a clear view of the back entrance to Kane's office. Meanwhile, Tavak moved through the town like smoke. He used the deepening shadows of the alleyways, climbing to the low rooftops with the agility of a cat. From his vantage point on the roof of the general store, he could see everything the layout of Kane's men, the horses tied outside the saloon, and the back of the livery where Maeve was hiding. An hour after sunset, they arrived. Moway rode into town not with a war party, but with only 4 of his most loyal, brutal followers. It was a sign of confidence, of arrogance. They dismounted and swaggered towards Kane's office, their faces set in stone. Moway was tall and powerfully built, with a cruel twist to his mouth. He was the dark mirror of Tavak, all the strength, none of the honor. Maeve watched from the livery as Kane himself, flanked by Silas, whose head was bandaged, came out to meet them. Silas's eyes burned with hatred as he looked at the Comanche warriors, but he held his tongue on Kane's command. They exchanged tense greetings and disappeared into the office. This was the moment. The plan had 2 parts. Maeve's job was to create a diversion, a loud, undeniable commotion that would draw everyone out into the open. Tavak's was to deliver the proof. Maeve took a deep breath, her hand closing around a small, sharp awl she'd concealed in her sleeve. In the next stall was Kane's own prized stallion, a magnificent black creature, spirited and ill-tempered. It was the linchpin of her plan. Whispering an apology to the animal, she unlatched its stall, slipped inside, and gave it a sharp, deep prick on the flank with the awl. The result was instantaneous and explosive. The stallion screamed in pain and fury, kicking out and splintering the wood of the stall. It burst out into the main livery eyes, rolling a force of pure panic. It charged out the open doors and into the street, 1,000 pounds of terrified horseflesh. It galloped past the saloon, scattering Kane's men, who shouted and cursed as they scrambled for cover. The back door of Kane's office flew open. Kane, Silas, and Moway's warriors spilled out, drawn by the chaos. "What in damnation is going on?" Kane bellowed. "Get that horse!" As all eyes were fixed on the rampaging stallion, no one saw the shadow detach itself from the rooftop across the street. Tavak dropped into the alleyway behind Kane's office, landing silently. The single guard left at the back door turned at the sound, but it was too late. Tavak disabled him quickly and quietly, and slipped inside the now empty office. On Kane's desk was a crate, its lid pried open. It was filled with brand new gleaming repeater rifles. Next to it was a document, a map. It showed Maeve's old homestead, marked with an X, and vast swathes of surrounding territory, all outlined in Kane's neat script. This was the deal codified on paper, the price of a war. Outside, the chaos was reaching its peak. Moway looked on a smirk on his face, enjoying the white men's incompetence. Kane was screaming orders. This was Maeve's cue for part 2 of the diversion. She lit the wick of a lantern, took aim, and hurled it into the driest pile of hay in the livery. The hay ignited with a whoosh. Flames roared upwards, licking at the dry timber roof. "Fire!" Maeve screamed at the top of her lungs, playing the part of the terrified woman perfectly. The cry of "fire" was a death knell in a dry wooden town. Kane's men, their attention, now torn between the horse and the blaze, were in complete disarray. The fire grew with astonishing speed, casting a hellish dancing light over the entire scene. It was into this tableau of chaos that Tavak emerged. He didn't come from the alley. He walked calmly out the front door of Kane's office into the main street. In his hands, he held one of the new rifles and the map. Everything stopped. The men fighting the fire, the men chasing the horse, they all froze. Moway and his warriors spun around their eyes, widening in utter shock. "Moway!" Tavak said, his voice calm, but carrying over the crackle of the flames. He held up the rifle. You told our people the white man was our enemy, yet you come to their town to take their weapons. Mo stared as if he'd seen a dead man rise. You, he stammered. I am here. Tavak said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He held up the map. You promised the warriors a war to reclaim our lands, but you were selling them to this man, he pointed at Cain, for a handful of guns to make you chief. A low murmur went through Mowe's 4 warriors. They looked from Tavak to the rifle, to the furious, trapped expression on Mowe's face. The truth was there, stark and undeniable in the firelight. He lies! Mowe roared, desperation in his voice. He is a traitor who sides with them, kill him. But his warriors hesitated. They had seen the proof in Tavak's hands. They had seen Mowe meeting with their sworn enemy. The seed of doubt had been planted. Cain, seeing his plan disintegrating, made his move. Kill them all, he screamed to his own men. Kill the savages! The street erupted into a maelstrom of violence, but it was not the fight Cain had envisioned. From the bluffs overlooking the town, a hawk's cry echoed the signal. Kono and his 4 warriors descended, not as a charging horde, but as silent, deadly arrows, picking off Cain's scattered men with breathtaking accuracy. The fight on the street was a swirling, desperate affair. Maeve, armed with her Colt, took cover behind a water trough, firing at any of Cain's men who tried to get a clear shot at Tavak. Silas charged at her, his face a mask of rage. I'll kill you myself, you witch, he roared. Maeve stood her ground, firing twice. The big man staggered his charge, slowing, before he finally crashed into the dust. The true battle was between the 2 cousins. Mowe, screaming in fury, drew a massive hunting knife and rushed Tavak. It was a brutal personal conflict. They crashed into each other, a whirlwind of muscle and steel. This was not about land or guns anymore. It was about honor betrayal and the soul of the Quahadi people. Tavak was faster, more fluid, but Mowe was a brute, his strength fueled by pure rage. They rolled in the dust, trading blows. Finally, Tavak used Mowe's own momentum, against him, twisting and gaining the upper hand. He pinned his cousin to the ground, his knife at Mowe's throat. Tell them the truth. Tavak grunted, his face inches from his cousin's. Tell them you left me to die. Mowe spat in his face. You are weak. Your peace would have destroyed us. The fight was over. The last of Cain's men were dead or had fled. Kono and his warriors stood over Mowe's defeated men. Cain himself, seeing his empire of dirt turning to ash, was trying to crawl away into the shadows, but Kono stopped him with the point of a lance. The whole town was illuminated by the burning livery. Tavak stood breathing heavily over his defeated cousin. He had won. The lie was broken. But as he looked around at the chaos, the bodies in the street, and the terror on the faces of the few townsfolk peeking from their windows, he knew the war was far from over. He had only just fired the first shot. In the flickering light of the burning livery, the chaos of battle gave way to a stark and silent reckoning. Jedediah Cain, sputtering threats and promises, was cornered by the very townsfolk he had terrorized. At Maeve's sharp-tongued condemnation, their fear turned to rage, and they dragged him away to face a swift and brutal frontier justice. The true judgment, however, was between the 2 cousins. Tavak stood over the defeated Mawe, not with vengeance in his eyes, but with a cold resolve. You will not die by my hand, Tavak declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a chief. You will be taken before the council to answer for your lies. You will live with your dishonor. To a warrior, it was a fate worse than death, As the first light of dawn painted the sky, the time came for them to part. The chasm between their worlds, briefly bridged by their fight for survival, now seemed impossibly wide. "You must go back," Maeve said, the words aching in her throat. "Your people need you. And you must rebuild." Tavak replied, his gaze soft. "The land is yours. You fought for it with the heart of a warrior." He reached into a pouch and produced a single perfect eagle feather. "This is for a debt that can never be repaid. For my life." She took at her fingers, brushing his. The brief touch was a painful reminder of everything they could never be. "Will I see you again?" she whispered. Tavak looked from her face to the rising sun, a sad acceptance in his eyes. "The sun rises every morning, and the earth is always here to meet it. They do not live in the same house, Maeve, but they share the same sky." With a final lingering look, he mounted his horse. Joined by Kono and his warriors, he led his prisoners out of the wounded town and rode east, a prince returning to his kingdom. Maeve stood alone in the dusty street, the eagle feather clutched in her hand. Her home was gone, but her spirit was forged anew. She had found a dying man in a scorpion hollow and discovered a prince. In saving him, she had saved herself. Turning her back on the town, she faced the long road to her land, no longer a lonely widow, but a woman who knew her own strength, forever bound to the Comanche prince who shared her sky. The West was full of stories like this, tales of courage and conflict that were never written down in the official history books. The story of Maeve O'Connell and Prince Tavak is a testament to the fact that the deepest divides can be bridged by the simplest acts of human compassion. It reminds us that enemies are often just people whose stories we haven't heard yet, and that true strength isn't about building higher walls, but about having the courage to open a door. Their story proves that even in a land defined by violence and prejudice, a bond forged in mutual respect could change the course of history, one small forgotten homestead at a time. What do you think, could two people from such different worlds ever have found a lasting peace? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this slice of the Forgotten West moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a true story of grit and unlikely alliances. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic, untold history of the American frontier. Thanks for listening.